Thank you so much for having this conversation with me. And I really wanted to talk to you because we are coming up to 25 years of Stop the War. So I really wanted to just ask you, how was it nearly 25 years ago?
Well, it was an amazing experience because we set it up after 9/11. And of course, when 9/11 happened, the whole of the media and the whole of the government and the US government was all completely, this is the most terrible event. We've got to wage war against these people. At that time, this was the Al-Qaeda and Afghanistan, because it was a Taliban-led government in
Al-Qaeda was actually positioned
in Afghanistan. They were in rural parts of Afghanistan. So it was very, very clear that there was going to be war. And we took the position that, this is me and a number of other socialists, including John Rees and Chris Nynham, we took the position that however bad 9/11 had been, there were reasons for it, and that actually the war would be much, much more damaging, much more destructive in terms of death and everything else. So we set up a meeting which we called Stop the War Before It Starts. And everybody said to us, you mustn't do this. I mean, all sorts of people said, you won't get anybody there, nobody will agree with you. And as it, that really, it's so bad what's happened that nobody, it's one of those terrible events where nobody will support you.
9/11.
Yeah, and you saw people jumping out of windows and all sorts of things. It was a horrible thing. So anyway, we called this meeting at Friend's house in Euston, and we were overwhelmed with the response. We completely filled the hall, which was over 1,000 people.
Yeah.
We had an overflow upstairs, and there were still like 500 people who couldn't get in. So we had all the speakers going upstairs and outside and, having 3 different meetings going on. And we knew then that we obviously had a big movement on our hands. And I was very struck even then. There were a lot of Muslim women, young Muslim women in the audience. The audience was very mixed, but it was very noticeable. And we hadn't had a huge amount to do with the Muslim community before that. But anyway, we set up...
I don't even think the Muslim community had been very politically active as such.
It had done things around Bosnia, maybe, things like that. But really more kind of charity stuff rather than any political intervention.
Absolutely.
So then we set it up. We said, let's have a meeting a week later in the same hall, but an organising meeting, which was absolute mayhem. It was about 500 people came to that. And everybody was shouting, everybody had different views, people wanted to, everyone wanted to speak.
Yeah.
And I was chairing it, and it was pretty crazy meeting. But in the end, we did come out with a campaign, the Stop the War Coalition, and somebody in the meeting actually said, we shouldn't just say stop the war, we should be against Islamophobia and also in defence of civil liberties.
Yeah.
And that was put to a vote, so that was passed. And that's how we started. And we started campaigning against the war in Afghanistan. That was the first thing. We met all sorts of people, particularly Muslim women, like Salma Yaqub in Birmingham. And she was a young mother with 2 young children, I think she had at the time. And of course, she was suddenly abused after 9/11, which she hadn't been before. She was a hijab-wearing woman, and she was abused in the street, and because there was a wave of racism against Muslims afterwards.
It was. I remember, because I used to wear hijab in those days.
Yeah.
And actually, I think 9/11 was bad, but it was also 7/7.
Yeah.
I even had a friend at the time saying to me, "Why did your people do that?"
Yeah.
I'm like,
It's not my people. Yeah. Well, 7/7 was also, you see, for us, we'd been saying up till then, look, okay, 9/11 happened, but there is no evidence of terrorist organisation in Britain.
No.
But of course, after 7/7, there was, and that again was a terrible attack. lots of people were killed in London.
It was horrific.
Yeah, yeah.
It was horrific. It could have been any of us.
Yeah.
And that's the thing. That's the terrorism. It's indiscriminate.
Yeah, that's right. And of course it does, what it does do is then makes all sorts of people it's terror, and people get frightened.
Absolutely.
They're very hostile to it. So we had to deal with that, which obviously was difficult. But again, in both times we said, look, you've got to look at the roots of why this is happening. We don't agree with Al-Qaeda. We don't agree with the people on 7/7. But why has terrorism grown? And that was something that we campaigned around, and I think quite successly,
I remember I was on the marches, the Million March.
Yeah, in 2003.
Yeah.
And they were just amazing.
Because I think at the beginning with the Afghanistan war, I don't think there was as much kind of the public coming out as much as Iraq.
Yeah.
What was the difference? What do you think?
Well, I think with Afghanistan, firstly, it was quite new to everybody, and it was just the aftermath of the shock of 9/11. So, of course, the whole consensus in the establishment was that, this has to be done, and that we don't want to do it, but we've got to do it. Everybody, if you remember, supported the United States. I mean, Russia and China on the UN Security Council, all of the different people actually said, yes, this is so terrible, we've all got to support it. But then it was very clear that they were wanting really to go for Iraq. Straight away, it was clear that Iraq was the main enemy of Bush and Blair. So I think what happened is, people said, well, okay, Afghanistan, even though we got quite a big demonstration against Afghanistan, we had probably 60 or 70,000 people on that. But I think people thought, well, okay, but it hasn't solved anything. Now they want to do it in Iraq. There's no evidence that Iraq was in any way connected to 9/11. So that began to break down. Plus, I think we got all sorts of different groups together. I mean, if you look at what Stop the War was, it was a quite militant, lots of anti-imperialist, anti-war movement. Then you had CND, which was the traditional kind of peace movement. And then you had the Muslim community. So you got all three of them coming together to organise the thing. And that was incredibly powerful, because we would never have got into all the Muslim community. A lot of the peace movement people were quite suspicious of us to start off with. They thought we were too militant and too sort of left wing. So getting everybody on board was very important. And then it just took off. We had these huge meetings.
How did you do it?
I think a very key thing, and I think it's true now with Palestine, I think we don't have enough meetings on Palestine or Middle East or wherever you want to do it. So people kind of like, free Palestine. Everyone's in favour of that slogan, but what does it mean? What does this peace deal mean, if it is indeed a peace deal, as opposed to a scrap of paper by,
it's a real estate...
which Donald Trump has put forward,
it's a real estate kind of agreement.
So I think what we did, we had public meetings everywhere, and we took a position that we would always, if people wanted a speaker from Stop the War, we would always provide one. So we went all over the country. I remember
going to these actually locally.
And I remember one in Bradford in the summer of 2002, where there was like 300 people, again, loads of the Muslim community, and they were absolutely, particularly the older Muslims, they were absolutely overwhelmed by these meetings, because they'd never been to a meeting like this. They'd always had a very separate life, and suddenly it was all kind of coming together. So I think that we got the school students involved, who had 2 strikes in the run-up to the Iraq War, which were very successful. And I meet people now who are now like 40, who say to me, oh yeah, I was on that, I walked out of school. And that happened all over the country. Again, very underreported, but it did happen.
It was also, now that we're talking, it reminds me, it was a lot of local action. I remember going to Greenwich and walking from Greenwich to Lewisham or something, and meeting people who became lifelong friends. On these, the people who are speaking, people who are organising Stop the War. And going to local meetings in in Brockley, in a cafe.
That's right. And we had a big meeting in the ballroom in Brockley with Tony Benn. That's right.
I went to that. I was there.
So you see, you have all these. And of course, Tony Benn was a huge asset. Various other people were, but he was very, very good on it all. And we got these big meetings. George Galloway was involved, and he was an extremely good speaker. So we got hundreds of people coming to them. And that all snowballed. We got huge numbers of coaches coming down. And the interesting thing is, although we didn't stop the war, obviously, and that was, I mean, even by the time we had the huge march, the American troops were already going to Kuwait, and all that was already in.
Parliament wasn't really, in a way, listening to the people.
It was shocking, Parliament, because what Parliament did, Blair spent several days where he just lobbied his own MPs to make sure that he got a majority. He only got a majority because the Tories voted with him, and although quite rightly you blame it on Blair, of course the Tories were completely behind the war. But what I think is important is that Blair has never recovered from that. He had to resign. I mean, the agreement to get him to resign was during the Lebanon War, which obviously you remember very well, in 2006. And then he went in 2007.
Exceedingly well.
And and even now, they're saying he may not be able to play this colonial viceroy role in the Middle East because so many people are saying he's not suitable because of Iraq. Not just because of Iraq, but mainly because of Iraq, you know. So I think for all those reasons, it was tremendously successful.
So what do you think it achieved? I know we didn't stop the war. And because a million people died in Iraq or were died and injured. I mean, it was horrendous for Iraq. And Iraq has never recovered.
It's never recovered. And if you look at what's happened in Gaza, we shouldn't be surprised at the number of deaths and the genocide, because that's exactly what happened in Iraq. And the same people who supported that are now supporting what went on in Palestine. But I think what it did do in Britain, it changed people's ideas and their consciousness. So there is much more skepticism towards war. Now, partly they've used Ukraine to try to counter that, to say, you know, we've got this enemy, Vladimir Putin, we've got Russia, we've got China who are against us. And that's had some success, but I would say it's very superficial. I think they'll find it extremely difficult to do a war like they did over Afghanistan or Iraq with an invasion and an occupation. I think that is virtually impossible for them now.
I think you're right. I think that probably is impossible. But if you think about what's happened in Gaza and kind of the plans and you know, even Doha being bombed and yet everyone being quiet about it, they're like, okay, that shouldn't have happened, but that's about it. I think created
Trump told Netanyahu to apologise. That's all that had to happen. You know, I mean, it's shocking.
It is shocking, and as an Arab, it's also shocking for me that the Arab governments all just said a few words and carried on business as usual.
But are you surprised at that, really? Because their whole, you know, the whole thing has been lip service towards the Palestinians going back for nearly 80 years. But in terms of doing anything for the Palestinians, it's a very different story. And we know that. We know that in Jordan. We know it with Egypt. We know it actually in Lebanon. I've been to Sabra and Shatila, and you see the horrors there, and you hear from the witnesses about what happened there. So, I mean, the role of the Gulf states in particular has been appalling, but also of Egypt, which was the first, you know, the big Arab nationalist country under Nasser, and people expected some, and, you know, he did talk about, you know, a united Arab world.
There was for a while, And, I mean, I grew up as a child in my grandmother's house with a huge portrait of Nasser in the salon, you know, like the
I can imagine,
It was like I was a child and I'm like, I have no idea who this, and I was in Catholic boarding school, so I assumed it was a saint. I think I found me once kneeling and praying because I thought it was a saint.
Well, he probably was regarded like that for a lot of people.
I think after he died, that picture disappeared and my grandfather's photo was put up instead, so he was also dead. But so I remember as a child that idea of Arab nationalism. So in a way, is the idea of nationalism, whether it's Arab nationalism or British nationalism, is it a kind of anathema to a global liberty movement? Or?
Well, that's an interesting question, isn't it? Because, I mean, there's a world of difference, I think, between British nationalism, which is nationalism of a colonial and imperial power, and the nationalism of oppressed people, obviously in Palestine, in the Arab world.
How is it different?
Well, I think because people for example, if you look historically, whether it's Ireland or India or Zimbabwe or South Africa or any of these things, people grow up with an understanding that they are part of an oppressed colonial people, and therefore, in lots of ways, their first response is going to be, we've got to unite as a nation against the colonial oppressor. And I think that explains a lot of, I mean, if you look at the Indian flag, it's the same colours as the Irish flag, because they took it from the they took it from the Irish, because the Irish were the first who fought against the British Empire in 1916 and then in the early 1920s. So that's why India has those colours the same. And if you look at all of these, you can see how the solidarity between these different groups of people. But of course, the national liberation movements had their own limitations, and they were divided by class. There were people who were prepared to compromise with the oppressors in order to achieve power. That happened in India. It happened in Ireland, actually, if you look at who actually came to power in Ireland. So I mean, so there's a difference between that and the way that now you've got people waving the flags, and which, to me is a really bad development. Not because, people want to wave a flag or have a flag in their garden, a Union Jack or a England flag. It's entirely up to them. But when you've got 50 down a high street, or when you've got it, painted all over a roundabout, then you've got to say, why is this happening? And is it happening to intimidate people from ethnic minorities? And I think there's a lot of sign that is what's going on.